In this lesson, we'll add feature lights and adjust the general lighting of the scene. So what we have in front of us is a render of what we have at the moment as our starting point. So most of this lighting has already been done when we created our context model. And the reason why this is a good idea is because as you're developing your model, you may want to render out your progress so that you can see and show within your presentation or your portfolio of the project how you came up with the design that you have. So anyhow, at the moment we have a render which looks a little bit bland, and I would like to push the lighting a little bit further so that we can get some more excitement out of our building. So already we can speak about two different types of lighting setups. We first of all can have a typical daylight scenario where we have a completely white model. Very often this looks very good in architecture, and I'm going to do that by just adjusting the override material and making it render a little bit whiter. So I'm going to reduce the saturation, make it a bit whiter here, and I'm going to just remove that edges texture that we had. So I'm just going to remove it by unchecking that diffuse so that we don't read that edges texture. Now I'm going to pause the video, make a render, and let's just have a look at what a pure white render looks like of this model before we go and do the alternate option B. So here is a render in pure white. You can see that the time is much less. We have about a half or a third of the time of the previous render with the materials because we don't have any of those reflections happening. We just have a single plain diffuse white or off gray color. So already this is quite nice when you're doing very conceptual backgrounds to your work. So for example, rendering something like this and then adding a label saying what different elements are is quite nice because you can fade this out with a white background, and they do work very well for presentations when you're not trying to look too realistic with what you're doing. In any case, I'm going to, for this course and for this lesson in particular, choose to do a more complicated lighting setup where we do add slightly more realistic materials in terms of a scale model still. So I'm going to go back into my V-Ray settings, undo my override material. You can see here I didn't have a pure white. I had to turn it into a slightly just off-white gray color. Otherwise I would have had to tone down my lighting a lot more because the scene was too bright in a fully white texture. So for the lighting, what I'm going to do is look at two different types of lights for this lesson. The one is going to be a single point Omni light, and the second one will be an illuminated V-Ray light material. So already if you have a look at the scene, if I just type in Shift L on my keyboard, you can see your existing light at the moment. So we have these two V-Ray lights. One is your primary, the bright one. This is the secondary bounce light. And then we also, if I just hit F10, we also have our two HDRI, one which is the low-res blurry one creating our GI environment, and then the sharper high-res version creating our reflection and refractions. So I'm going to go in now and add a few feature lights. I usually do this on my default layer. So I'm just going to make sure that these lights as well are on default. And I'm going to continue to add more lighting to the project. So I'm going to again turn off some of the layers so that I don't have too much complexity. We can turn them on again further on as we go through. I'm going to turn off the facade, and I'm going to just leave the space frame for the moment and the expo pods, since these are really the elements that I would like to go and illuminate. So let's go now into our lighting tab or lights and go down to standard, and I'm going to use ordinary Omni lights in this case. So I'm going to position a couple of Omni lights within the building. I'm not going to put them at the ceiling. I'm just going to basically hang them in the middle of the space itself. So I'm going to put one in this corner, and immediately I'm going to move it up into the right height so that it is sitting more or less in between. So this is just going to internally illuminate my entire building so that I can start to read this translucent or even transparent facade once we get that lighting working. So next, when you're working with light, it very often helps to use a selection filter. So I'm going to choose lights for that, which means that no matter what I do in my scene, I'm only going to be selecting and working with the lighting. So I'm going to hold down Shift and create a few instances of this light, just basically working around this internal volume still. So I'm going to add two over there. and perhaps make 3 more copies. So we basically have a series of 8 lights all instanced together that are inside my building. So that is the result of that one. So next I would like to add some lighting to the domed element that we have above the tree. So what we're going to do here is to first of all find the element, the layer, so that we can turn that on and start working with it. Next, I'm going to just isolate out this domed object that I want to use as a lighting object. So what I would like to have shown here is on the inside, I would like to illuminate these frames with basically strip lighting going along the entire frame. So if you really are doing a very fast modeling workflow, you may just turn this entire object into a single material with a basically illuminated V-Ray light material. So that's exactly what we're going to do right now. So hitting M on my keyboard, I'm going to bring up my materials. I'm going to go down to V-Ray light material, and I'm going to adjust the color to be slightly warmer yellow. And this is going to be called V-Ray light. I'm going to then apply that V-Ray light material to my entire dome structure, and then isolate out. So what that's going to look like now in my scene is that the entire dome is going to basically glow, and that's going to give me quite an interesting effect. I'm going to add that same material onto this lift shaft on the inside, and that will hopefully give me a nice effect as well, as this is illuminated on the inside too. Next, we're going to be working with these pods, these expo pavilions on the outside, and what I'd like to do is create these triangular portions on the underside of this canopy that are going to be illuminated as well. So here we're not going to illuminate the entire object because that would be quite unrealistic. This one is fine because we're going to see it from far away, so you won't really be able to pick up whether it's the structure or a light under the structure. So for these objects, let's make a copy of the entire thing. So Control V. I'm going to isolate out that copy. So you can see the same workflow is pretty much happening in almost all of the steps that I'm doing. I'm going to collapse all of these objects down since I'm going to be now using them as source objects. And next I want to go and select the underside of the canopies for all of these objects. So this can be a little bit of a tricky process. I'm going to start by selecting just the canopy itself and selecting the inverse and deleting that. Then I'm going to go in and figure out a way of selecting only the polys that are underneath. So I'm going to do that by selecting using the border selection. And if I select the border of all of them, you will see that only that tiny little circle has been selected. That means if I control click on polygon, it's going to convert my selection to the underside. I can now Control I delete again, and I only have the underside being selected. So another speed modeling tip is definitely understand how you can very rapidly select polygons before you work on them, because one of the things which would be enormously time consuming is if you wanted to manually come in and select, perhaps even using the by angle function, you could come in and manually select all of the undersides, but that would still take quite a lot of time if, let's say, you had 200 of these objects. So knowing which way you can quickly select an object is very rapidly going to speed up your workflow so that you don't have to waste time selecting things before you actually work on them. So what I'd like to do to these objects now is just to inset a smaller triangle on the inside. So I'm going to select all of the polygons, just Control A on your keyboard, and I'm going to choose Inset in the menu. I'm going to choose the by polygon option and then just create a smaller poly here on the inside. I'm not going to go too small so that I don't have too many overlapping triangles. If you see that happening, then you basically want to avoid that. I'm then going to choose that 0.15, and I'm going to again Control I and hit delete. So this object now that I've created is what is going to be illuminated. I'm going to move it downwards by 0.05, and that means the object is going to be sitting just below my actual canopy object. So this can now be illuminated using that light material just by selecting that. And right now we have a completed set of lights, and all of them have been done at once without necessarily working on them individually. So what we can do now is start to render out what our lighting setup is doing. And we're going to do that in the next lesson, where we adjust the general lighting as well as these feature lights that we've gone and positioned around. And we're going to have a look at how we can basically create a more interesting looking view with all of this feature lighting. And at the same time, we're going to be working with some of the materials, because we may see that we need more reflection or more transparency in certain areas. And we're going to adjust materials based upon how they are being lit and how they are being rendered in the test renders that we're going to do very shortly. So all of that is happening coming up in the next lesson.